Hello and welcome. I'm Lori McFerrin with the ALS Association. For those who are joining us for the first time, we're glad you're here. We offer this monthly Living with ALS webinar on topics that have been requested by people within our community. And of course, welcome back to those of you who have joined before. There are just a few things that we want for you to know before we get started. Every webinar is recorded, and within just a couple of days, this recording will be available on our website. There will be time at the end of today's presentation for questions. And throughout the presentation today, feel free to use the Q&A section to enter any questions, and hopefully we'll get to all of them within our hour today. Immediately following our webinar, you will be asked to participate in a brief survey. This survey gives us information on whether our presentations are meeting your needs and also what topics you'd like for us to tackle next. And let me reassure you, we are listening. Because of the feedback being provided, we have scheduled presentations on what's new in research, communication support, and emergency planning and preparedness coming up in the next few months. Today's presentation touches on a topic that is frequently asked about. How can you be resilient or mentally tough when facing a disease like ALS? Amber Johnstone is a social worker who works with us here at the ALS Association. She has helped countless families face their own unique challenges, all while striving to help them find joy and continued purpose in their lives. We're grateful that Amber has agreed to join us and share her experiences and expertise with us today. Welcome, Amber. When you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lori. Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here. I always enjoy holding these conversations, and I hope the topic's helpful today. As Lori mentioned, it's one that comes up frequently in my work with the association, and I know it's an important question and something that a lot of folks are looking to learn more about. So we'll go ahead and get started. I always like to give a little bit of information on myself, but Lori mentioned I'm a social worker. I've been with the association since 2018, and I'm currently a care services manager in Northern Ohio. But my work before I came to the association was in hospice and palliative. And during my graduate studies in my master's program, my focus was always on terminal illness and end-of-life care ethics. So I've always been passionate about working with folks who are in a really unique and sometimes often difficult position. And it's really important to me to help folks navigate their way through and try to find purpose and quality and, like Lori mentioned, joy, because it's there and it's worth finding. And when I'm not working, I am at home with my husband and my two children. So you can see their smiling faces there. And my dog, Winnie, and I always joke that she's my furry coworker. Thankfully, she shares an office space pretty well most of the time, but she's good company. This is a quote by Maya Angelou, and I like a lot of quotes by Maya Angelou, but this one especially I thought rang true today. And it says, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." And I think that's resilience in a nutshell, really. We're going to explore more about what that means, but I hope this is something that can ring true for you today and something that you can take with you. A couple of things we'll cover in our conversation today: more about what resilience is and what it's not, what makes someone naturally resilient, why they are the way they are, and how we can become more resilient. And some of you might be asking, why are we talking about this? I think resilience is, you can think of it as an important tool to help you deal with really hard things. And I think it's no secret that ALS is a really hard thing. So according to the American Psychological Association, psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting to change in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Really, what it means is it's the ability to bounce back from difficult experiences. And if we think about something that is resilient, if you can picture a rubber ball, if you've ever held a rubber ball in your hand, it is kind of bendy. You can squeeze it and when you squeeze it, it bounces right back. If you throw it on the ground, it bounces. They don't break really. So rubber balls are something that are resilient. And I always think of rubber balls as being kind of tough. And in the title of our discussion today, I put that resilience can be mental toughness. And honestly, I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. I think people who are naturally resilient do tend to be mentally tough, but I don't think that you have to be mentally tough in order to be resilient. I do think you have to be courageous, though. When we're going to talk today, we're going to talk a lot about choice and being intentional. And I'm going to talk a whole lot about making choices. And the first thing you have to do when we're talking about resilient and building resiliency is you have to choose to be courageous. Some of the things that resilience is not, it is not the freedom from emotional distress. Resilience and being resilient does not mean that you will never feel bad or that you will never deal with things that are emotionally difficult. It doesn't mean that you'll never have stress in your life. It does mean that you have to be intentional. And so resilience is not something that happens without intention. It's not something that happens without repetition, because we're never good at something when we first, well, I shouldn't say never, but oftentimes we're not good at something the first time we do it. It's something that takes practice, and it's something that has to happen over and over again. And so it takes time too. When we think about what makes someone naturally resilient, on this screen, you'll see some traits of some people that tend to be what makes up someone who's naturally resilient. But as I was talking to folks in my own life who I consider to be naturally resilient, when I spoke to them, I asked them if they found themselves to be naturally resilient. Did they find themselves a resilient person? And I'm thinking of one person in particular, and she said to me, "Man, I've never thought of myself as being resilient. I don't know if I'm a resilient person." We talked more about it, and as I described kind of what makes somebody resilient, she kind of just said, "Well, isn't that just life? It's just life. Things happen. We have to keep going." And she kind of had this attitude of, "Well, what's the alternative?" And I thought it was interesting that when I was talking to people that I found to be resilient, a lot of times this is kind of the attitude that they had, that it's just life. We just have to kind of live. And the people that, the research out there shows that people who tend to be naturally resilient, or things that make someone resilient, have the following traits. So they have an understanding of trauma. And we'll talk a little more about trauma, but they have an understanding of trauma and how that affects them. They have a presence of a support village, or even just a perceived presence. So again, we'll talk about what that means more, but even just the idea of feeling like you are supported seems to be one of those things that leads to being resilient. Genetics make you resilient, and also some childhood experiences that lead to somebody being resilient. People who are naturally resilient tend to have a childhood where they have loving, present, and emotionally responsive caregivers or parents. They're also allowed to face challenges and stress, and allowed to kind of figure those things out for themselves. And they also have caregivers or parents who are supportive of self-soothing, emotional regulation, and also secure attachments. So it's important to note that genetics and your childhood are two things that we can't really do anything about now. You can't change your genetics. And assuming you're an adult sitting here listening to this presentation, you can't go back and change your childhood. So it's important to understand those things and to understand what makes somebody resilient or more naturally resilient. But in terms of talking about how we become more resilient, I just want you to know, if you're asking yourself, why am I not a naturally resilient person? It may be related to some things that you have no control over. So just keep that in mind. A little overview of what I'm going to go into more detail about. There are kind of 4 things that really go into building resilience or becoming a more resilient person. And those 4 things are intention, positive emotion, repetition, and time. So I told you I'm going to talk a whole lot about choice, and you can see that on this slide. So when we talk about intention, intention really is choosing to do or not to do something. So you might hear somebody say, I'm intentional about this, or I'm choosing to do this with intention. So when it comes to intention, really what we're talking about is choosing to engage in behaviors that are likely to lead you to be more resilient or be able to deal with those difficulties with a little more ease and grace. So I told you really the first step is to choose courage, be courageous in this, but also just choosing to be resilient. You don't have to be resilient. You have to choose it to want to get better at this. So you're going to choose to learn to practice strategies to deal with stress. You might have to look at your priorities and see if your priorities really make a whole lot of sense given the situation you're faced with. And also choosing to find meaning in negative events. The next step of this is talking about positive emotion and choosing to engage in behaviors that create positive emotion. So things like humor, relaxation, optimistic thinking, and also avoiding toxic positivity. And we'll talk more about that, but really, you can have too much of a good thing when it comes to positive emotion, and it's largely backed by science, and that this is overall really does a whole lot for your emotional well-being. But we'll talk about what toxic positivity means as well. I said repetition. Something interesting to think about is resilience comes from facing difficulty over and over and over again. You don't become resilient if you're not facing difficult situations. So repetition is one of those things that helps build resilience. And somebody with ALS or a loved one, somebody who has someone in their life that has been diagnosed with ALS is going to face a lot of difficulty over and over again. So it's another reason why I think this is an important conversation to have. And also, new skills take practice. I said that before. I'll say it again later on in the presentation too. We're not always good at things that we're trying for the first time. New skills take practice and time. You're not going to become resilient overnight. So these things take time. Diving a little deeper into intention. So making those choices. The first one is understanding trauma. And I want to talk a little bit about trauma. So trauma is one of those things I think it's kind of a buzzword, I think, lately. And trauma means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I wanted to define trauma. And a medical definition of trauma is physical injury. And I think of trauma not just of physical injury, but of emotional injury. And so we think about emotional trauma. Trauma really happens when something deeply distressing or disturbing is experienced. So some people I'll talk to and they'll say, I don't have any trauma in my life. I don't know what you're talking about. Something that's traumatic is somebody who witnesses a horrible accident, or, has to the witnessing the World Trade Center's accident. That's trauma. But trauma can be receiving an ALS diagnosis. It can be dealing with the loss of mobility. I mean, these things really can be trauma. And so when it comes to understanding how trauma affects you, it's important to know that trauma or negative experiences can affect you physically and emotionally. So one of the things you can do to help build resilience is just to understand how your trauma is going to affect you individually. Also, is important to reprioritize and set boundaries. That's hard. Setting boundaries can be really hard if it's not something that you've routinely done. And when you have a major life change, like an ALS diagnosis, you really may have to draw back and kind of look at what some of your priorities are and decide, do those priorities line up with things? Things have changed now. So do these really make sense? Are my priorities in line with what they need to be? And knowing that, does that mean that I need now to set some boundaries that I didn't have to set before? Do I have to look at relationships that I have with people? Do I have to decide what's healthy for me and what's not? Do I have to say no to some things? And really, reprioritizing and setting boundaries can be as simple as that, saying no to some things. Acceptance is another important concept, and acceptance can be polarizing. It can be emotional. Some people I talk to, they think of acceptance and giving up as things that you can use interchangeably. I don't think of acceptance in terms of that. A lot of people say, well, if I accept my diagnosis, that means I'm giving up. That's not what I'm talking about today. Acceptance here is really talking about knowing what you can and can't control. There's a whole lot in our life that we don't have control over. And so practicing acceptance is kind of taking that on and knowing that there are things that you just can't control. And it doesn't help to fight those things. You have to kind of let go of some of those battles. Talked a little about building or leaning on your village. And so that can be as simple as sitting down and talking with someone that you trust about, who is my village? Who are my support people? What does that look like? Who are the helpers in my life? Who can I lean on? And there's some interesting research, as I was doing some research on this, of what the presence or perceived presence of support really means for someone. And so one of the studies I looked at and how to build resilience was the role that a support network plays. And what was kind of funny about it to me was that even if you just have the feeling of being supported, that was enough to build resilience. Even just feeling like you have people around you that care for you and support you was enough. They didn't even have to physically be with you. And so thinking about that, you want to think about, where is your support coming from? If you're feeling kind of isolated, it may be things like a virtual village, like social media, or support groups, virtual support groups. Those are people that really maybe aren't next to you in your day-to-day life. Maybe you just see them online once a month, but just knowing that those people are there, you may leave feeling more supported once you've had an interaction like that. And just that can be enough to help you build resilience. Another thing that's important with intention is meaning making and purpose. So finding meaning in negative experiences can be really important. And this is a big one for folks that are approaching the end of life, whether they have a life-limiting illness like ALS, or they're just approaching the end of life for whatever reason. Meaning making is one of the things that really helps someone feel or report feeling prepared for death or having less fear of death. If those people who say those things, they feel prepared and they're not afraid, generally attribute those feelings to feeling like their life had meaning, that they had purpose. So meaning making can be a really big deal. And ways to do that are setting some achievable goals and also redefining hope. So in setting achievable goals, sometimes we talk about bucket lists. And I always try to tell people, you want to make sure that you've got some goals that are easily achievable for you. Don't stress yourself out with goals that are really hard to do. It can be good to have dreams, but it's really important to have achievable goals. And redefining hope. I think redefining hope could probably be an hour-long conversation in its own, and maybe a really good topic for another talk. But redefining hope is one of those things that is really closely linked to resilience. I'm going to talk about another study. There was a research study done with a group of folks that had metastatic colorectal cancer. And the reason that's important to know is that metastatic colorectal cancer can be, no cancer is good, but it can be one of the really, really bad ones. It can be one of the ones that's really, really bad news, and survivability can be pretty low in some instances. So folks with metastatic colorectal cancer may be in a similar situation to someone with ALS. And so that's why I found it important to look at this group of people, or that's why this research study kind of piqued my interest. So what this study it looked at a whole lot of things, but it looked at what people with this cancer reported, what levels they reported of hope, how much hope did they feel. It looked at pain and suffering, it looked at resilience, but really the thing that was interesting to me was that hope and resilience were so closely connected. It showed that people who reported high levels of hope, or scored high on the scale that they used to determine hope, had high levels of resilience. The two were really closely connected. They also reported that people who felt they had high levels of hope and therefore had stronger resilience reported lower levels of pain and suffering, which I thought was interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting, that this study found no correlation between activities of daily living. So those daily living is, if you remember, it's the tasks that we do every day for ourselves, like bathing, dressing, grooming, feeding, things that you're able to do for yourself. There was no correlation between being able to complete activities of daily living independently and hope, which I thought was interesting, because a lot of times I think about mobility, and people report things that they're able to do from themselves, and how they feel when they're no longer able to do those things, or how they report they think they'll feel when they think about not being able to do those things. And in this study, it really showed that it didn't matter if you were able to do those things or not. It really didn't impact how you felt about hope. So hope is, I think, a really important key to helping you build your resilience. The next thing we're going to talk about is positive emotion. And really, when we talk about positive emotion, we're talking about mental health and wellness, right? It's just that overall mental health and wellness piece. So things that can help improve positive emotion is humor and relaxation. So if we talk about folks that were naturally resilient, things they tended to report were that they were able to find humor in just daily life. They were people who had a really good sense of humor. So if you can find humor in some of the daily things, we know that that will lead to an increase in positive emotion and positive mood. So that's something that's important to know. And also, those people tended to be really good at relaxation. And relaxation is one of those things that you can achieve in a number of different ways. You can, whatever you like to do, relax. Everybody does kind of different things sometimes, but those two things were important for positive emotion. Another thing that was important was optimistic thinking. And people that are naturally resilient tend to identify as being optimistic. Optimism is one of those things that you have to work at sometimes. I myself am more of a pessimist, believe it or not. And so for me, I really have to work hard to find the good things sometimes, or to be optimistic, or to look at things with a glass half full kind of mentality instead of a half empty mentality. So if you're like me and you're one of those people that tends to be a more pessimistic person, you may have to work a little harder at this. And there are lots of things that you can do to work on having a more optimistic mindset. Things like gratitude journaling, or having just a practice of identifying things that you're grateful for every day can be a good first step in that. Another thing that leads to good positive emotion is emotional regulation. And emotional regulation basically just means that you don't allow your emotions to control you. So a couple of things you can do to learn to do this, because not all of us are good at this. It's something that you think of children as having difficulty with emotional regulation, but believe it or not, a lot of adults have a difficult time with it too. and it is something you can learn to do better. One of the things you can do is learn to observe your emotions without judgment. So thinking of your emotions first, being able to identify your emotions, that's kind of the first step. So whether you're able to stop yourself in a moment of high emotion, or even if you're just reflecting back on a period of high emotion after the fact, if you can stop and kind of observe that emotion for what it is and say, man, I was really upset, or man, I was really mad, or was really sad, or really happy, whatever that emotion is. So thinking about times of high emotion, learning to identify them and be able to just observe them without judgment for what they are. So not assigning them as being good or bad, just noticing what they are. And to take it a little step further, to be able to allow those emotions to come and go. And this can be hard for a lot of people. I struggle with this sometimes. So if we're thinking about a cloud moving by on a windy day, that cloud just kind of goes across the sky with the wind. And so our emotions can be the same way. We can feel that emotion like a wave, and it can come and it can crest, and then it can go back away again. So the goal with this is to not hold on to those really intense emotions. So not allowing one moment that you felt very mad or somebody made you very angry, not allowing that moment to stick, and not staying mad, not staying in that emotion. So allowing those emotions to come, feel them, acknowledge them, they're valid, and then let them go again. And one of the ways you can kind of do this is by learning self-soothing techniques. All kinds of things can be self-soothing techniques. I actually have helped people create a self-soothing kit. So a basket or a box or something where you quite literally put the things in this basket that you know help calm you down or help relax you. So whether that's a warm blanket or a heating pad, a puzzle book, maybe a playlist of some music that calms you down or makes you feel good. Fidgets, if you've heard, fidgets are really popular right now in schools and things like that. Fidgets can be things, if you're a tactile person, somebody who likes to touch things, you can put some fidgets in there, some things that are just kind of fun to keep your fingers moving if you're able to do that. So having things to turn to in a moment where you're, highly emotional, or you're stressed out, or you're just not feeling good, to soothe yourself, to kind of bring yourself back down to that baseline. And then also connection. How can you connect with others? Have a connection plan. That sounds kind of silly, I know, but have a plan for how you're going to connect with others. That may mean working with a speech therapist if you are somebody who's having some difficulty with communication, or your communication needs are changing. The last thing you want to do is become isolated. So planning for connection and really thinking about what connection looks like for you and how you can stay connected to people. So I mentioned that we would talk about toxic positivity. And this is something I see quite a bit. And a lot of people, I don't even think they realize that they do this, but it can be kind of common. So toxic positivity is basically the belief that no matter how difficult a situation is, you should maintain a positive mindset. And what that does is it rejects all negative emotion. I am sure if you are someone who has an ALS diagnosis, or someone who has a loved one who has had an ALS diagnosis, you have heard when you've tried to express a negative emotion to them, you have heard someone say, you just got to stay positive. So yes, positive emotion is good, but we can also kind of go on the extreme of that into the land of toxic positivity, where we're rejecting all negative emotion, we're invalidating that negative emotion, and we're really minimizing the experience. And if you've ever had that happen, you know how horrible it feels to have somebody really kind of tell you that your experience is not that important or not that big of a deal. Well, excuse me very much, it is a big deal. So what you can do, one, if you tend to be somebody who turns to that toxic positivity and you're kind of just I refuse to have a negative feeling. I'm going to be positive all the time. You can work to try to manage the negative emotions that you feel without denying them. They're valid. It's perfectly okay to have negative emotions. What's important is that we don't hold on to them all the time. So find ways to manage those emotions without denying that they exist because they're valid. If you're dealing with someone who it tends to be overly positive all the time, what you can do if you find yourself in a situation or conversation with that person is you can ask them to listen without offering a solution. So you can say to somebody, hey, I really don't need you to fix this for me, or I don't need you to tell me that it's going to be okay. I just need you to listen. Just need to talk about this. So keep those two things in mind. You can manage negative emotion without denying it. And you can also ask for somebody to listen and just hear you without offering a solution. And those two things can go a long way in kind of managing that overly positive situation. Repetition. So I mentioned that you can't be resilient unless you're faced with adversity or you're faced with challenge. You are going to be faced with a lot of challenge if you have ALS or you have a loved one with ALS. So that's not going to be an issue. You're going to have the opportunity to have difficult situations come up. What's important to know is that one, resilience doesn't happen without being faced with those challenges. And two, that you really have to practice this. You might not going to be good at the first time you try it. You might not be great at it. So fall back on that intentional practice. Know that this is something that it's a new skill. It's just like strengthening a muscle. It takes time and you have to keep practicing. You have to keep doing it. And also time. It takes time. You have to have experiences in order for you to have something to respond to, but also it just takes time for you to learn how to do these things. So keep that in mind. Know that these things don't happen overnight. Know that it's okay if you try it and you're not great at it at first. Keep falling back on these practices. So to kind of recap, resilience in a nutshell, if you're going to try to build resilience, you want to be intentional about practicing these skills, intentional about making choices, choosing to build a village, choosing to practice acceptance, choosing to find meaning in a negative situation. We want to work on positive emotion and mental wellness and mental well-being. We want to work on emotional regulation and being able to recognize our emotions for what they are, knowing that it's okay for emotions to come and go, good or bad. Trying to find an optimistic perspective, trying to look for the good in things without falling into that toxic positivity. You want to be aware that it's something that happens over time and that it's something that comes from experience. And again, just that new skills take time to build. I have this quote on here again because I think it's just a really, really good quote. And I think it really just encapsulates what resilience is. So I'm going to read it to you again. But Maya Angelou she was onto something here. So I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. So ALS might have happened to you, but you are so much more than your ALS. You are so much more than a caregiver to someone with ALS. You are so much more than the negative experiences that you have that you can't control. And you can choose to not allow these things to define you and reduce who you are as a person. So know that change happens, but know that life can continue and you can find positive, you can find good, you can make meaning, you can do all of these things, and you can deal with some of those negative experiences and those really hard and really painful experiences with a little more ease if you try to practice some of these things. So keep that in mind. Here's some contact information for me. We got through that information pretty darn quickly, so we'll have some time for questions. But here's my contact information. And then at the end of this slide, there's also just some references. If you're really, really interested in any of the information that I shared or those studies, research studies that I mentioned, some of those are here, but I can certainly get that information to you if you are curious. So thank you very, very much. I hope there are questions because we really did get through that quickly.
Amber, thank you. I feel like any of us, no matter what our relationship is, whatever brought us here, I think all of us can gain something from your presentation today. I do want to encourage folks to use the Q&A section, but there are a couple of things that I was thinking about, and I did share a couple of them with you earlier today. First of all, I use the term village a lot, and then you used it in your presentation. But I don't know if you found working with folks as I have, people will say to me, I don't really have a village. I wasn't the social person. I, don't belong to a church. So I'd love to hear your perspective about, how you help people identify their village, because it probably turns out there's a lot more people caring about us than we might initially recognize.
Absolutely. A village can mean a lot of different things. And I think that's kind of the first step is just what does a village mean? And to me, it's really it can be anybody that you interact with on a regular basis. So I think it's a good idea if you're having trouble identifying your village to sit down with somebody that that knows you well, that you love and trust. Or even a care coordinator truly could help you do this, but sit down with somebody and start making a list or start just talking about who are the people that I regularly encounter in my life. So maybe it's immediate family members. Hopefully it's some friends. It's probably some medical professionals. It's probably your neurologist, and if you've got a social worker or anybody on that ALS clinic team. It may be people that you interact with online. It may be Facebook friends. It may be support group members. So I think if you're having trouble identifying who maybe is your village, starting simply by just making a list or even just thinking about who are the people that you interact with in your life, you may from there be able to identify some more individuals that you might be able to reach out to. And I encourage people to actually kind of keep a list of contacts of people that you can reach out to if you need just somebody to talk to. Because if you know your friends well enough, you probably know there are some people that are going to be able to just listen. Some people aren't always good at that. If you've got somebody who's just a fixer, that might not be the person to call to if you just need to talk. If you just need to talk about something and you don't need a solution. You're probably going to know who's going to be better at those conversations than others. So I encourage people to make a list and keep a list of contacts of people you can reach out to when you need them.
That's a great point, that we wouldn't necessarily reach out to the same person when our needs are different. Mm-hmm. So we've got some great questions. Let's address some of those.
Good.
So the first one is, how would you suggest supporting a spouse or a caregiver who doesn't want to talk or acknowledge, isn't ready yet to accept a hand, won't consider a support group or reading information?
That is tough, and it's really common. And honestly, the answer is that you let them know that you're here, that you're there to support them. Or if it's not you, there is somebody who can. But all you can do really is let them know that you are there and that you are willing and ready to talk and support if they're ready. We can't make people do things. We can't make people accept help. And sometimes those people are getting support and we're just not always seeing it. So letting them know that you're there, but not pushing it really farther than that. And then really looking at what your own support needs are. So usually when somebody says to me, my husband, my partner, whoever, they won't talk about this. They won't talk about it. They refuse to talk about it. And I don't know what to do about it. They need help. They need somebody to talk to. So once I give the suggestion of, hey, like, do those things I just mentioned, let them know you're there. I turn the conversation back though and say, that sounds really hard for you too, though. It sounds like that's hard for you to know that that person needs help and maybe you're not the person that's able to be that support. So turning back and really talking about what are your support needs and who are those people that you're getting support from.
That's an excellent point. And I wonder, while you're talking about that, I wonder if you can address scenarios where it might be a husband-wife situation or a partner situation, and one of them is really trying to remain private, and yet the other one really feels like we need more help. We've got to let folks in. Any guidance or sharing with your partner? I don't think we can do this alone anymore.
Yeah. Being open to that conversation, for one, that can be a really hard conversation to have, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to have that conversation. Not all of us are really able to accept help very easily, especially if we tend to be the helper. So one, just being vulnerable enough to have that conversation. That's the first step, talking about it. But two, if you are the partner who feels like you need the help and you're not able to do this alone, being able to say that, and even maybe saying, this might be more for me than it is for you. This is the help that I need to get through this. So it's a lot of open communication. If those conversations are hard or you feel like you're not getting anywhere with those conversations, enlisting some professional help can be a good idea. So reaching out to the mental health professional in your life, or your care coordinator, or your social worker, or your doctor, whoever, they might be able to get you in touch with somebody who can either help be present for that conversation or just help you with some strategies to have that conversation.
Thank you. Really nice. I'll get back to the Q&A section. Someone has said, I keep hearing I'm brave and courageous. Why am I being told that when I haven't changed mentally? What is so courageous about having ALS?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair to say. Yeah, because ALS happens to you, right? It isn't something that you choose. So I think that's a label that maybe other people are putting on you. And maybe I even did that today when I said you're choosing to be courageous, to be resilient. So that can be hard when other people label us. You don't have to be courageous. You don't have to identify with that label. That is perfectly okay. I think other people try to make sense of the things that they see happen to other people. And so that may even be a way for them to just deal with the fact that they're seeing somebody go through something hard. We as humans like to label things. We like to put things in boxes. So that's maybe more of just an observation or a comment. It's okay if that label, that word, you don't relate to that. That's okay. And it's okay to say that to people too, that, if you really have a strong reaction to, I don't want to be called courageous. It's okay to say that. That's allowed to. You don't have to be.
Thank you. Another comment, so not so much a question, but I find that journaling is my outlet to address my frustrations. Sometimes I share the journal, but many times I just vent to the journal and I'm able to release what is frustrating me.
Wow, that brings up a great point that I talked about, how sometimes just the perception of having support can do the job. You don't even have to actually have the support sometimes. So a journal as being a support, that's a really great idea. So yeah, journaling in and of itself is a wonderful technique to process your thoughts. I encourage, if you haven't tried it, try it. Letter writing is really powerful for people. And the idea is not to send the letter. It's not to write the letter to send it. It is to write a letter and usually not send it. Sometimes you burn it, you throw it away, you rip it up, you do whatever. But writing a letter to someone that you wouldn't ordinarily tell something to yourself, to God, to whatever, to somebody that you wouldn't ordinarily say something to face, letter writing can be really powerful. So that's just one form of journaling. But I'm so glad that that was brought up. That's a really great tip.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. Next question is, why did my support system leave me? When I was first diagnosed, tons of people came out of the woodwork wanting to help. Now that I need help, I have one friend left who is amazing, but I can't keep asking them for help.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, this is a common thing that happens. So sometimes we help people and we don't do it. This sounds odd. This might be something to kind of have to try to wrap your brain around. Sometimes we help people not to help that person, but to meet our own need. So we help people because it makes us feel good. Yeah, we're helping somebody else, but we're really doing the helping because we're fulfilling our own need. And I think that happens a lot when people find an outpouring of support when they're first diagnosed, and then that support goes away. People want to help because it makes them feel good. And so you'll find that maybe they're fulfilling their own need. They feel badly that you were diagnosed and they don't really know what to do with that. So they're going to offer to help. The other thing that happens is a lot of times a diagnosis it's a big event, right? So it's something that you're talking, you might be not, something that people talk a lot about. You get a diagnosis, people start talking, they hear about it, but then they might not hear updates. So you might not be regularly updating people. You don't have to, but a lot of times you're giving this update when you get this news, but then you're not providing updates throughout. So I think it's kind of one of those out of sight, out of mind things where you're on their mind, they're thinking about you when you first get that diagnosis, so they're ready to help, but then they don't really think about it afterwards. They're not offering. So you can reach out and ask. A lot of times people are very, very genuine when they say, let me know if I can help with something. What they're saying to you is, I want to help you, but I don't know how to help you. So I think you can reach out to those people and ask, hey, you mentioned before that you were willing to help. Are you still willing to help? And here's what I might need help with. That can be hard to do. So maybe enlisting that friend to actually help you expand your support network might be a good thing to do, especially if you're feeling like you're asking that person a lot. Maybe they can kind of help you expand that support a little bit.
I like that suggestion, Amber. It might be that when some folks are initially diagnosed, people are asking how can they help, and maybe there's not a lot to do initially. And then as things change, again, like you pointed out, if they haven't gotten an update, they might not know that now is a really good time to step in. That's not always the case, but it is sometimes. And so if you can start thinking about creating a list of things that would be helpful, because all of us help in different ways, and reach back out. I like that idea. I know we have at least one more. This is a comment from Willie. I tell people that tell me I'm courageous that I'm just living one day at a time and living the best life I can every day. Oh my gosh. And Amber, your talk kind of started with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like that person might have might be a resilient person already. So they've got a good place to start.
Yeah, I like that. Just doing the very best that I can, I think the situation you gave us was, I'm just trying to live my life.
Mm-hmm.
And Kimberly reminds us there is a website out there that people can set up an account to list things that they need help with. I'm pretty sure what Kimberly is talking about is Care Connections.
Mm-hmm.
We've spoken about that a couple of times, both in our webinars and a lot in our support groups. So if you go to ALS.org and look up Care Connections. And it's a nice program to just try and enlist help with many different things. It doesn't even have to be care, right? To have somebody stopping by and socialize or have somebody listen, as Amber had talked about. So really great thoughts for today. Let me see if there's anything else. Pam says, you mentioned a bucket list, achievable goals. What might those goals look like to a 90-year-old mom that was recently diagnosed? So she's 90. She lived a wonderful life until this diagnosis. Great question, Pam.
That is a great question. So maybe you feel like you've achieved all the things you wanted to achieve already, which is okay. So maybe think smaller. Maybe even think, I really want to go to a baseball game. I want to send cards to people this year. I really want to send cards to all my friends on their birthdays. I don't know, it can be anything, but it's also okay to, I'm wondering if maybe this is the feeling of, I don't know if I need to have a bucket list because I feel like I've lived a pretty good, fulfilled life. And that's okay too. So I think in that case, achievable goals may be a little smaller. Maybe things that, maybe you're not even thinking of them as goals, really, really simple, just tasks. So I don't know, but I would be happy to explore that further. But that's a good comment that maybe people don't know where to start when it comes to setting goals.
Yeah, that's great. And then not knowing that 90-year-old woman, and not knowing what's important to her. So probably checking in with her to see what she thinks is worth focusing on. There's one other comment, and Cynthia has put in the Q&A the link for the Care Connection. So thank you, Cynthia. Folks should probably be able to see that. All right, one more question. I don't dwell on what was or what will be other than planning. I focus on today and what I can be grateful for and happy about today.
That's a really good place to start. It can be hard to stay in the moment. That's a tough thing to do. So that's a really good skill to try to develop, to try to stay in the moment. Like you said, other than planning, there is some planning that we can't really avoid. But just staying where you are today in the moment is a good place to be.
Yeah, great suggestion for all of us. Hi, Jessie. Jessie writes, what I found works for me is getting involved with advocacy. It has given me back my power in the face of losing my strength. Oh my gosh, I love that line. I also created an aliveness list, which lists things I can do and plan for that make me happy and feel alive. Spectacular.
I love that. I like that better than bucket list and aliveness list. I like that. I may steal that. I may borrow that. I won't say steal. An aliveness list. I'm going to start saying that instead of bucket list.
Yeah, and what a great thing to focus on. What's making you feel alive? And I'll go back to Pam, who asked about for the 90-year-old person, what makes her feel alive?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jessie. And thanks for that idea around advocacy and that it gives you power in the face of losing your strength. That's really beautiful. I want to take just another minute or two to see if there are others who have maybe wanted to ask Amber a question and just haven't had a chance to do that. I'll give you just another minute or two. I want to thank all of you for some really great insight and thoughtfulness.
Lori, while you're looking at that,
Yeah.
I had a thought. Lori and I had chatted a little before, and we wondered if maybe people would have a feeling of, what do you do when you can't feel optimistic, or what do you do when you're really having a hard time finding the positives, that positive emotion? And I wanted to bring up that it is perfectly normal with ALS to feel just about anything, to have a really, there is no normal when it comes to emotion. But if you find that you are stuck in that emotion, that you are stuck with that helplessness and that hopelessness and that nothing is good, my question would be, does anything make it better? Or are you feeling like this all the time over a period of time? Because depression is really common in ALS, but it is not normal in ALS. And I have heard people say that, oh, they're dealing with some depression. That's normal. That's to be expected. It's really not. So negative emotions are normal in ALS. That's to be expected. But true depression, true feeling stuck in those emotions where nothing makes it better, that is not normal. And you don't have to live in that. ALS is hard enough on its own. You don't need to struggle with depression on top of it. So if you are feeling that way, I would say it's time to talk to the doctor about that to see if there's maybe more there. Because if it is something like depression or anxiety or something along those lines, it's treatable and you do not have to be miserable in that way. So depression is common, but it's not normal in ALS. So I want to make that point.
Excellent point. I think that's all of the questions. So I'm just going to reiterate a couple of things. And you're talking about when to reach out to the doctor. That's another great example of why you should have a list of your village, because there are reasons you would reach out to a doctor, and there are very different reasons why you wouldn't, and you would reach out to a sister or a nephew or something. So identify some of those folks who are in your village, or maybe who were in your village and you want to bring them back in. Amber, thank you. This has been a really great conversation, and thank you to those who participated and shared ideas, shared some great insight and some really good realism. I appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
We were happy to have you, and we're going to wish you all a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you again next month. Take care.